I'd like to thank Continental this morning, who are sponsoring our new Women in Sport panel, which is chaired by Sharon Hutchinson this morning. I know we're really looking forward to hear whether these esteemed women think that sports journalism can be the Trojan horse for real change. And I have to say, Sharon is a Trojan. She has worked really hard on this and on her own sportswomen's.ie. So really glad that she could actually spend the time here this morning and do this, the inaugural Women in Sports event. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Sharon and she'll introduce her panel. Thank you.
Good morning everyone, and welcome to a discussion on the role of women's sport in the media. This is the first time we've had a session regarding sports journalism at this conference. And when it was suggested that this session would occur, I jumped at it, because I believe that the role of sports in our teenage girls is underdeveloped and undervalued, and this conference would be an opportunity to keep the growing momentum that is developing in this area. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sharon Hutchinson and I run the website sportswomen.ie, a website which supports, promotes and reports our female athletes by giving them the much needed media exposure they deserve. Historically, sports journalism has been seen as the poor relation within the media world. However, society takes a huge number of its role models from sporting idolatry, and as such we underestimate the value that sports journalism has in providing role models for our teens and laying the foundation for the next generation of leaders. This is glaringly obvious when we speak of male sporting role models. Can sports journalism be the Trojan horse which creates these female role models that our teenage girls aspire to be, and so value their own athletic ability, good, bad or indifferent, to learn the lessons of teamwork, competition, camaraderie, winning and losing with grace, that they will develop the confidence to become the next generation of business and political leaders? We have a distinguished panel of 5 speakers who will offer their perspective on sportswomen and the media. The session is sponsored by Continental Tires, and their commitment to women's soccer in Ireland has to be respected and applauded as they sponsor the women's domestic game. So I'd like to thank them for sponsoring our session, our guest speakers and our hosts Joan and John O'Connor for making this morning happen. So our speakers today, I'll introduce them briefly first. We've Fiona Coughlin, former Irish rugby captain, Anne McCarthy, Sport Ireland. We have Emily Glenn, co-host of the Fair Game podcast, Cliona O'Leary, deputy head of RTÉ TV Sport, and Sue Ronan, Irish soccer manager. Our first speaker is Fiona Coughlin. She has been a fantastic ambassador for women's sport in the last few years. She captained the team that beat the Black Ferns in the last World Cup, the only Irish team to have beaten New Zealand. She was part of the team that persuaded the World Rugby to host the 2017 Women's World Cup in Dublin and Belfast. She's commentated on the Six Nations and is an expert in all things rugby. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Fiona Coughlin.
Good morning everybody, I'm delighted to be here, my first time in Ballybunion, beautiful spot, I'm sure I'll be back again. I suppose I've been involved in Irish women's rugby in the national team since 2003, and at the time that was very like the embryonic stages of the game in Ireland, and we weren't really that worried about media attention. We were more worried about getting ourselves together and I suppose what we were producing on the pitch. The first couple of years were tough with a lot of losses but a lot of learning along the way, and we were always progressing, and I think for me that was key. Every year there was progression in what we were trying to do. 2008 we kind of fell in under the men's Six Nations as well, so we were invited to the launch over in London, and there was a little bit of tokenism. The men sat on the main stage and we were pretty much only interviewed by Scrum Queens, which was a voluntary website that just covered women's sport, and still today they're the leaders of women's rugby, the leaders in women's rugby and all information about women's rugby. They put a lot of unions to shame, and even World Rugby at times, with their content about women's rugby. Still, there was no media coverage really in Ireland. You'd probably get a line or the fixtures in the paper every weekend, but 2012 we played France in Six Nations over in France, and it was probably our best game against France over there, and we lost by 0.87 was the score, and came back that week, and on Wednesday I was getting phone calls from journalists. I was like, whoa, how did they get my number, first of all? But I was like, this is brilliant. But they had no interest in talking about the game. They had an interest in our travel arrangements, that we ended up only getting 3 hours sleep before the game because we had to travel overnight. And it was a little bit disappointing because while they referenced the scoreline in all their articles, there was a couple of hundred words, and it was all about how the IRFU had failed us. But at that time I felt the media were failing us, not talking about the game and what a performance that we had produced. But again, I got over that. I kind of said to the girls we needed to be successful if we wanted that coverage, and still that wasn't our fight. We needed to produce it on the pitch. So we went away that year, and going into 2013 I had said we need to do one better. We consistently sat third in the Six Nations, that we needed to do better, and we went into that game or that championship in 2013, and we played Wales first and there was no coverage. Then we played England and we beat them 25-0, and there was only a couple of hundred people at the game, and I think maybe the Irish Times were the only people covering it at that stage. But then when you beat England again, the phone started hopping, and this was a sign of change. You know, people were starting to talk about the game and what a performance it was, and that we'd set ourselves up for a triple crown and hopefully a championship. So then the bandwagon started to roll, and we went over to Scotland, and a couple of the girls were more excited about meeting Michael Corcoran after the match than actually winning the game. But it was brilliant to have, you know, radio there, all the newspapers, all the top newspapers there. And you know, the story kept going. We played France, we beat France, so had won the championship, and then we were going for the Grand Slam in Italy, and to hear that RT were covering it was brilliant. And it wasn't for us as players then, but it was about the game and how we could grow the game and get more people involved in the game, because the numbers were still quite small at our level, and also particularly at underage level. So for young girls to actually see a game on TV and know, like, I'm still asked, oh, are the rules the same? Is there contact? And so for people to actually see it on TV was a huge thing, and I suppose it kind of got rid of a few misconceptions about the game. We won that game, and it was brilliant to bring home silverware. Unfortunately, it wasn't the best display of rugby ever because the conditions were appalling, and when that's your thought after winning a trophy, it's a little bit disappointing that it couldn't be the best kind of performance that we could put in place. But we had a trophy, and we got to go on the Late Late Show, which is a very Irish thing to be proud that you get to go on the Late Late Show, but it was brilliant. And I think it was at that point that the Irish public got behind us and sat up and kind of paid attention to us, and some of the girls' names were becoming recognisable, and a lot more coverage in papers as well. And then back in another Six Nations season, and it kind of dipped a bit, the coverage dipped. You know, RT Radio were at our home games, the Irish Times were consistently covering it through Gavin Cummesky, but still the crowds were back down again. And, you know, it wasn't consistent, and you look at spreads of the men's games, and you know, back-to-back cover, and maybe just a small article on the women's game, and not featuring the players, not telling the stories that kind of grasp the public's attention, which I think is key to it. So 2014, obviously Six Nations, we were back down into third place, but a game was shown on BBC against England, and you know, things were still kind of there or thereabouts. There was media involvement, but not a huge amount. Then the World Cup, and going into it, yeah, there was a little bit of coverage. For the first time, we ourselves had a media liaison officer with us from the IRFU, which we never had before. People didn't read too much into our first game about the USA, but for us that was a huge game because they'd beaten us in the previous World Cup. They were ranked above us, so there wasn't much about them, and we beat them, so we were sitting nicely in the table. And then the next game, the Black Ferns or New Zealand, and I suppose we were written off by a lot of people. It was brilliant. Sorry, the games were on TG Cahir, which was obviously brilliant, but the timing of the games did not lead to probably a lot of people watching it. You'd play a game at 12 o'clock, 5 o'clock, and then sometimes in the evening. So the New Zealand game, obviously we won it, which was brilliant, and the whole thing went crazy. Twitter was just unbelievable. I heard we didn't actually get to, I suppose, experience what was going on at home with the papers being on the front page of the papers, radio, TV covering it, which was huge. And I suppose huge part of our journey as well was having all that attention around us. But again, it wasn't for us, it's about those future girls, to get them engaged in the game and get them playing the game. I suppose we eventually bombed out in a World Cup semi-final against England in what was an appalling display of rugby again by us, and one that we weren't used to against England. We were used to losing against them, but we normally played quite well. All of the media coverage after that game was really positive. we got to a World Cup semi-final, well done. But I actually find that quite patronising, because if the men had played in the same manner that we had, they would have been slated. And I think for us to kind of be respected, we needed to be talked about in the exact same way that the men would have been in a game of rugby, and just analysing it as a game of rugby, which it wasn't. I suppose that would be my gripe with the media. We've had a brilliant relationship with them. You know, we had Michael Corcoran present our jerseys at one match. You know, Damien O'Mara, all of those people, Jackie Hurley, RTE, they've been really supportive of us. But it would have been appreciated if they actually commented on the game as it was, which was a poor game of rugby. Going on now, there's been more games on RTE, which has been brilliant. I think I've turned from playing to commentary, which is tough enough when your teammates and friends are playing, and if they're not doing the right thing, that you have to call it as it is, because if you don't, it's not just a bad reflection on your knowledge, but it's a bad reflection on the game. And I always say we've one chance to captivate people. If they don't see a good game, they'll just comment that women's rugby is not good enough. So we've one chance to engage them, and they have to see it for what it is. I think when people talk about women's sport, and you know, it's brilliant that there's this panel here, and there's brilliant that there's discussion around it, but I wonder, are we still going to be having these discussions in the next 10 years? You know, I think there needs to be action. And from my point of view, it's not just about the media, and I think the media get an awful lot of stick from the public out there for not showing the games, but we have to change the values of society around women in sport, and it comes from the athletes producing a product and having something to pay for it, and they'll continue to do that and be role models for girls going forward. The national governing bodies, they need to stand up, they need to promote the game, they need to have a plan in place how to engage the public more, because at times I think they've failed that. Like, I think the Ladies GAA this year with Lidl and the ads and things has been absolutely sensational, but we need more sponsors and more governing bodies doing that together to get more people engaged. And finally, the media, they are a vital cog, but they need the other things in place beforehand before they can take hold of it and tell the story. And there's stories there to be told. So I would love to see the actions put in place. And I'm positive about women in sport. I'm positive the direction it's going. Yes, it's going slowly, we could move it faster, but I think there's huge potential out there for the future. And I think time and time again we have female athletes putting their head above the parapet to be recognised, and now it's about giving them that recognition that young girls have those role models, and that they're visible role models to look up to, and hopefully that they'll be there in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fiona. Just to say as well, at the end we'll have a questions and answers, so you can think about what questions you're going to ask later. Okay, next up is Cliona O'Leary, Cork woman on loan to Dublin for the last 19 years or so. And I'm also wondering, is there a Drima League conspiracy to take over RTE? She's deputy head of RTE TV Sport, and she's a witness to the development of women's sport within the media from being non-existent 20 years ago to today's level of coverage. Cliona.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks also to Joan for including sport in this weekend of discussions around the media, because all too often sport can be forgotten about as very much an important part of the media. As Sharon said, I'm deputy head of TV Sport since 2010, and I've been in the sports department in RTE for 19 years, and in that time the landscape has changed utterly. Citizen journalism has given life to a lot more conversations and diversity, which is impacting on traditional media's appreciation and coverage of content which it might not have considered years ago. It's also true to say that the definition of journalist has expanded greatly in recent years. The democratisation of access to means of production and distribution now gives anybody with a passion for storytelling the ability to reach a wide audience without having to rely on traditional publishers or broadcasters. And we see that in the rapidly expanding blogger and podcast universe, which Emily will talk more about later. But the question here today is, can sports journalism be the Trojan horse for real change? I read this as, can exposure for women's sport on all platforms, in whatever form, print, radio or visual, bring change to the landscape of women's sport? and does more coverage bring more interest and more participation? And I think it can. It's important to have role models, the likes of Fiona and Sue, and you know, for young girls growing up, as Sharon mentioned earlier. But it's also really important for sponsorship and for the growth of the game. And I'm going to look at it from a television perspective, because I suppose, like a lot of people would say, well then why aren't you doing more in RT sports to cover more women's sport? We do cover a lot, and there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, but there's an awful lot, and actually Fiona has touched on it there as well, there's an awful lot of influences at play when deciding to put an OB into a ground. OB, like an outside broadcast, you know, with 70 cameras, it costs in the range of between 50,000 to 80,000 to do that. And so I suppose, what is it? What factors do we take into account when we're talking about putting in an OB into a venue? And firstly, it's, well, will the audience come? Will there be an audience for it? And what's the demographic of that audience? So I'm going to have a look in a few minutes about the viewing patterns of women in sport. Also, what's it going to look like in television? What's the ground and the venue like? But more importantly, what's the crowd going to be like at it? And then, you know, there are major influencers in the sports body, and as the sports body worked with the media organisation and tied it into contracts to say that we cover the women's game, and then there's the sponsor and the money that the sponsor has and where they're going to invest in, and are they going to work with us for all of us to be able to put sport out on television. And there's another aspect that I will speak about later as well. It's the importance of women putting themselves forward for decision-making roles within sports organisations, and that's really important. And I think all of these factors taken into account with the changing television sports rights landscape, then there will make change, because there are serious opportunities for women in sport now. I'm just going to start. Brian is going to put up. I'm only going to use just 2 slides, but I just think this is a very impactful slide. It just shows you the viewing patterns of women in sport. And you can see that significantly more women watch men's sport on television than they do women's sport. And in fact, like when you're looking at the camogie finals versus the hurling finals there, and I'm not sure if everybody can see it, but I'll say, like, you've got 4 times the amount of women watching the hurling finals than you've got of women watching the camogie finals. And in fact, like you've got 45% of women will watch the men's hurling finals, and 55% of men. That's the makeup and the demographic of the hurling finals, versus only 35% of women will watch, and 65% of men will watch the hurling finals, will watch the camogie finals. And maybe an awful lot of that is to do with the fact that we were all brought to matches and men's matches with our parents growing up, and that kind of has to change now as well. But, you know, also in the FAI Cup finals, and it's great we do show the women's and the men's FAI Cup finals on the same day, but you still have twice the amount of women watching the men's final than you'll have watching the women's final. And then in the rugby, and I just picked out the important games in the rugby. In the women's game, since 2013 to 2016, and you can see that again, twice the amount of women will watch the men's Six Nations than will watch the women's Six Nations. And you'll notice there in 2014 you had 151,000 watching the men's game, and then 118,000, which is significant, watching the women's game. And that was because the BBC showed England versus Ireland men's game, followed by the women's game in Twickenham, and the men's game there was the Trojan horse for the women's game. So it is, and also it's very important to mention that the quality of the match and the performance of the national team is a huge part to play in the ratings. But what these figures mean is that when you're around the table discussing where do you put your money, where are you going to put your investment, that you look at these kind of figures and you worry, like, is there an inherent implication here that maybe women don't want to watch women's sport? And then, Brianna, just the next slide. And the next slide, because we were trying to figure out, well, where are the women's audience and what are they interested in? And attendances at games is hugely important when deciding what to put your OB in for. And we saw that we did a survey last year, and we found that 17% of women had attended a national or international sports event over the course of last year, whereas 30% of men did. But moreover, only 1 in 5 women stated that they'd definitely go to attend a sports event in the next 12 months. And that's where sponsors can really come in here, and like Lidl, as Fiona said, have a really good campaign going. But actually, I just thought the Liberty Insurance campaign, that call to action, they had a hashtag support her sport last year, and I just thought it was one of the most inspired campaigns, because it just asked everybody to bring a girl, like your daughter, your niece, your granddaughter, to a match, just one game in the year. And you know, last year, to be fair, the All-Ireland women's football final got 30,000 people, which was the highest attended women's sports event last year. And I wouldn't be surprised if actually the Liberty Insurance helped make that happen. Also, Liberty Insurance, also actually, you know, as I said earlier, it's 50 to 80 grand to invest in an OB. Sponsors working with sports organisations, working with the media together can make change and can make it that we can all bring more women's sports events. And in actual fact, we're in the next week or two, we're hoping to announce, you know, expanded coverage of a women's game before the in this year, thanks to that kind of collaboration. And likewise, collaboration with the FAI back in 2013 showed us that since 2013 we've been able to show the Women's FAI Cup final, and that was RT went to the FAI and said, can you put the women's game in there, and if you can, we can cover both, and that's been working really, really well. So sports organisations committing to expand the women's game is really, really important. And likewise, you can see now that we've just put a bid in, you know, the IRB tied in the Women's World Cup with the Men's World Cup in their new tender this year, which is fantastic. And it means that every broadcaster bidding for the Men's Rugby World Cup now, the next two Men's Rugby World Cup, also have to put a figure beside the next two Women's Rugby World Cups. So we know, I mean, RT has put a bid in there, but we know that now there's going to be comprehensive coverage of the next two Women's World Cups, which is fantastic news for all of us. And also the Six Nations, and the Six Nations coverage has been a bit hodgepodge, you know. I mean, it's been difficult to try and get comprehensive coverage of the Women's Six Nations, and a lot of that is, like, RT actually put an OB into Scotland, we put an OB into Italy, but it's really difficult because consistency of schedule, we've got maybe clashing schedules and it's hard, but also an awful lot of the other countries weren't putting in OBs, so it's hard to show an entire tournament like that. But the Six Nations, and this is thanks to Fiona and thanks particularly to the women's rugby success, the Six Nations now are actually packaging the whole of the Six Nations together. So from 2017 you're going to have 3 years of really good comprehensive women's Six Nations coverage, and RTE are putting a bid in for that. So that's really good news for women's sport. Another aspect that's really important is the importance of women putting themselves forward for decision-making roles in sport, and that, you know, like, basically inside an RTE sport you've got a 60-40 split, so like 60% men and 40% women in the managerial role, which is really, really strong. And also in the 19 years I've seen massive change front of house, and you've seen it as well. We've got a really, really good panel of excellent female presenters now. But one thing that we find very troubling actually is in recent times, in the last year now, we've had quite a lot of jobs advertised, and women are not putting themselves forward for these jobs. And so it is something, and it's not reflected in RTE in other departments, but it just seems to be sports specific. So this is something that we're looking at to try and address, to try and understand why is it that women are not putting themselves forward for behind the scene roles in sports production. But in conclusion, like, in my view, the future for women's sport on television is really, really bright. Like, I could count countless stats I could give you here about the growth of women's sport on television worldwide. But one that really stood out for me is the Women's World Cup last year. It had the same pairing as the Women's World Cup in 2011. You had USA versus Japan. And in the US, and we follow very closely behind the US, the 2015 final saw a 67% growth in viewing figures. That drew an audience of 23.6 million. It was the most watched English language soccer match in US history. So, as I was saying earlier, like, the female viewership accounted for 43% of that audience, which was a 57% growth in the reach of females from the 2011 World Cup. So, as I was saying earlier, if more women watch women's sport and supported women's sport, then you'd have massive audiences, you know, and that'll grow television coverage as well. All broadcasters know the value of sport. In the US last year, there were 127,000 hours of sports programming available on broadcast and cable TV, and 31 plus billion hours were spent viewing sport, which is up 160% and 41% respectively in the 10 years previous. In the top 100 live TV programs in the US, 14% were sports programs in 2005. Just last year, in the top 100 live TV programs, 93% were sport. So that'll tell you the importance of growth for broadcasters, or the importance of sport for broadcasters. And likewise, just in Ireland, 60% of the top 20 programs viewed last year were sports programs. So as sports rights inflate at a phenomenal rate, broadcasters are vying for sports content, and women's sport should position itself in that place. So going back to the question, can sports journalism be the Trojan horse for real change? Yes, it can. But in terms of TV broadcasting of women's sport, sports bodies, sports media organisations, particularly public service broadcaster ourselves, but sports bodies, sponsors, and every individual, particularly women, have a big part to play as well. Thank you.
Next up is Anne McCarthy from Sport Ireland, formerly known as the Irish Sports Council. This body plays a huge role in the promotion and development of sport nationally, and a significant proportion of the government sports budget is dispersed to the grassroots via Sports Ireland. Anne led the development and coordination of the book Changing the Game, which she'll talk about in a moment, and this celebrates the success story of Ireland's sportswomen. Thanks, Anne.
Hello everyone, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. It's a great privilege. First of all, I don't come from a journalist background. I work in Sport Ireland. Sport Ireland is a state agency for sport in Ireland. We plan, lead and coordinate the substantial development of competitive and recreational sport in Ireland. Our remit is huge, but one of our key strategic priorities is to increase women's participation in sport. And before I go on to continue on, I'm just going to show you a quick video that we did last year. Video that we use to showcase our fantastic athletes, and that's the key word that I used here today, that they're athletes. One thing that we do in Sport Ireland is investment, but how we use that investment. We delivered 0.6 million will be given to national government bodies of sport this year, specifically for women in sport programmes. Not only at a national level, but we also think it's very important, you need to think locally as well. Additional investment will be given to 30 local sports partnerships all across the country this year, again, to get women participation in local sports, which is huge. One thing that we always do, our collaboration and partnerships with RTE is very important, and the Irish Times as well. The Irish Times Sports Awards, which Fiona Coughlin received 2 years ago, Fiona, you were the overall winner. Every month we pick a sportswoman of the month, and then in December we come together, and of the 12 nominees we pick an overall winner. And that day is one of the fantastic days in the calendar, and I look forward to it, because it's a day to step back and celebrate what Irish athletes have done, and more importantly what our female athletes have done. I'm privileged enough to work in Sport Ireland, and I get to meet some fantastic athletes, and their stories are absolutely amazing. What they do and what they continue to do for our country needs to be celebrated and continues to do so. That's why Sport Ireland, We did Changing the Game, which celebrates Irish women's sport from 2000 to 2015. The book is all visual. The images really tell their story. And but when you think, can media really change? It's a part of the overall thing. It's not collectively all together. We need to think locally. How many people here today, do they support their local sports? How many people attend their local games? Could I get a show of hands the last women in match you went to? Great, but it's not everyone. We need to start at a local level first. We need to make sure that we're going to our local community games, our local secondary school, our local GA, camogie, football, whatever it is, go out and support. We can't necessarily put it all down to media coverage. It's not. It's a part of the bigger picture. Sponsorship is huge. We have to take responsibility ourselves. What can we do? Look at social media, the value of that does as well. Our national governing bodies, they work obviously to promote the investment that we give goes specifically to women in sport programmes. And I said, there's a lot of investment going. But how do we know that investment is working? Because we see the gender gap is closing. The Irish Sports Monitor report shows that actually there is more female participations in sport than there ever was. It's not half and half, but it's nearly there. And we don't want half and half. We want more people, more athletes, more females. And we will continue to endeavour to do everything that we can to make sure that we have the right resources, the right structures in place to make sure that everybody has the same opportunity to participate in sport. In disadvantaged areas, teenage girls, older women, everyone, we're not just pigeonhole anyone to a corner, that we're giving everybody the right, not even just facilities, the right support that is needed. And that is something that is very, very important to us at Sport Ireland. We support not just high performance athletes through the high performance system and the facilities that our carded athletes use. We also support them through the national governing bodies, but we have an open door policy where they come in and we ask, okay, what's the problem? What can we help us? How can we help you? And we listen, and then we put the necessary, whatever facilities in place to make sure that they can actually excel in their sport. And that's hugely, because the Olympic and Paralympic year is going to be huge for us, and we've got there's more athletes, and Katie will hopefully, please to God, qualify in May in Kazakhstan at the World Boxing Championships. But they're there because of the sacrifices they make, of the stories that they have, that they give up to participate in sport. And to be, like Fiona was saying, one thing that I think is so unique, you just have the ability, the sacrifices, the mentality so strong. We need to concentrate on telling that story of, yes, we're an athlete, but what we do to get there. There's so much interesting facts that the RTE and Irish Times, that they'll pick up as well, and they actually want to see, it's the story behind it. It's how we connect with people, it's the emotions. And we need to continue to do that. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy for everybody in the audience here today, but I do have a few available that I will give out. And just look through it, and you will absolutely see the wonderful, wonderful athletes that we have, and the sacrifices that they make, and of the huge potential. And something that I just want to finish up on is that we need to step back, pause, and celebrate the fantastic athletes that we have in this country. Something we're very, very proud of, and something that we'll continue to aspire at. Most of our, please God, our medals in Olympics, these are going to come from women boxers. They're going to come from every other athlete as well that is going forward. They're going to give us such an immense sense of pride in our athlete. And I just want to say, first of all, to thank you to Fiona and to every single athlete that we have out there who are participating, who are representing our country, because the pride that they give us is just immense. So we say thank you, and it's something that we're going to continue to work towards, something that we're going to continue to build on. And yes, media is a part, but it's not the only part. We need to take responsibility ourselves. And I want to finish on that note.
Next up is Emily Glenn. Emily is co-host of the podcast Fair Game. It's a fortnightly podcast which focuses on women in sport in Ireland. Emily recently spoke at the Web Summit, inaugural Web Summit, the Web Summit on the topic of women in sport, so it's obviously a subject very close to our heart. So thank you, Emily.
Thank you very very much, and thanks for the invite today. As Sharon has said, I am the co-host of Fair Game. Fair Game is a fortnightly podcast that focuses on women in sport in Ireland. It's actually the brainchild of my co-host Elaine Buckley, who approached me randomly one day off of the internet, and with the idea of developing a women in sport podcast. And from there, from our first meeting, we started to develop our ideas, and we figured out really early on in the process that we didn't have the expertise or the resources to produce the podcast ourselves. So we approached a company called Castaway Media Productions, who very kindly agreed to produce it and host it for us. We did a ton of work before our first meeting, our pitch with them, about 7 million emails and a ton of pre-meetings just between ourselves. And we went into our first meeting and said, we want to make a podcast about women in sport. And they said, great, when do you want to start that? Because there wasn't one, and there certainly wasn't one that was hosted by two women. So from our initial meeting with Castaway, we started to develop Fair Game as you may know it now. One thing that really frustrated us was that any time women's sport was dealt with in the media, on a radio show or on a podcast, all of the issues that women in sport contend with were crammed into a 40-minute segment. And they weren't dealt with in any depth or comprehensively. They were just, it was just too much. The topics are too broad for 40 minutes of a chat, and we certainly could spend hours talking about each of them, so we figured we'd do it thematically. We would try and untangle the web of issues that surround women's sport, and we would deal with them one at a time. We would invite two panellists on, and every fortnight we would deal with one issue for 40 minutes. This has given us an opportunity to talk about some of the issues facing women in sport, but also given us a platform for Irish sportswomen and Irish elite female athletes to promote themselves and their sports. That's pretty important when you think about the limited opportunities for sports fans to get to know their female athletes. It can be really hard to be a fan of female sports in Ireland because the access to athletes is really limited. Media coverage for women in sport is so low. In 2015, there was a report in the UK about sports media coverage of women in sport, and the average is like 7%. Like 7% of all sports media coverage in the UK was dedicated to women. And when you break that down, it was 10% of televised sport media coverage was for women, 2% was national newspaper, and 5% was radio. Now, there's been no comparable study in Ireland, so we actually don't know. But PSG in 2015 did a sample study, and they put the figure at around 3.3%, which is kind of shocking. Like, that's not really on. Now, we know the tide is slowly turning, and we're certainly big fans of the dedicated Irish Times coverage every Thursday for women in sport, and we at Fair Game decided to be a part of that positive change, because the lack of media attention for women in sport has massive implications more generally for women's sport. It's often used as a scapegoat. It's used to support a vicious cycle which justifies low sponsorship and which justifies or accepts this alleged apathy that sports fans have for women's sport. And if we don't do something to disrupt that cycle, we end up with a system that just tolerates and justifies why women deserve less than their male counterparts. Excuses like apathy, you can't force people to be fans, or women aren't naturally as athletic, or oh, I didn't know they were playing. Well, all of those myths about women in sport fall away when you start to show women's sport and show fans what they're missing. And that's what Fair Game aims to do. We decided to stop ranting privately about these issues and to start putting our outrage to good use by showcasing Ireland's elite sportswomen and the issues with which they contend in 40-minute segments every fortnight. Because we are fortunate to have such incredible athletes. And we in Fair Game believe that sports media can be a catalyst for real and positive change. So that's it. Thanks.
Well done.
Thanks, Emily. Well done. Last but not least, we have Sue Ronan, National Soccer Manager and Head of Women's Football at the FAI. Sue has made great efforts to get here, with a couple of Euro qualifying matches abroad and then intervarsities to go to. It's great to have you here today, Sue. She's been manager of the national team since 2010, so we look forward to hearing what Sue has to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be here this morning, ladies and gentlemen, and indeed amongst a group of esteemed ladies at the top table here. As Sharon said, Sue Ronan is the name. I'm head coach with the women's football team, although in these parts I should probably say women's soccer team to avoid the confusion. And I'm also head of women's football domestically. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the landscape of women's football in Ireland, because many of you probably know just about the national squads. You may not have heard about much more that's going on, so I'll just give you a little overview of that. Where we are in terms of media coverage, and indeed a little bit about abroad, where media coverage is generally in the game, and then I know we're going to have some questions and answers later on. Just a little bit about myself. I worked in the health service for 23 years in Crumlin Children's Hospital. I'm not a nurse or a doctor, but I worked in the fundraising section, and obviously that was a challenge for other reasons, but great time nonetheless. At the same time, I played football for Ireland and worked as a voluntary capacity, I suppose, in football. So football is in my blood. I was also a coach while I worked in Crumlin Hospital. But my dream job came about in 2006 when I went full-time into the FAI, and I've been head coach since 2010, as Sharon alluded to. We're in the middle of a European campaign. We played 2 games there last week, beat Montenegro, lost to Spain, unfortunately. It probably was expected, because there's a huge difference between the levels in women's football. They're a top seed, we're a 3rd seed. We gave it a good go, but we lost. But we're now at the stage where we have 3 games left, and we have to win all 3. And if we do, we could possibly qualify for the European Championships, which obviously I think would really give a huge boost to women's football in Ireland, would kickstart lots of media interest, I'd imagine. I currently also oversee the domestic game, but we'll talk about that another day. So the landscape at the moment, we have approximately 21,000 registered players. About 5,500 of that are adults, the rest are young girls, and a lot of them started playing football in the last few years through a program called Soccer Sisters. Some of you may have heard of. It's basically an introduction to football for young girls, so it's got loads of numbers playing, which is fantastic. We've 32 leagues all over the country. Some have underage, some have senior football. Elite programs at 12s, 14s and 16s at regional and local level, grassroots programs specific for girls, and indeed our international squads at senior, 19, 17, 16 and 15. So lots going on. I'm not sure many of you in the room knew all that activity was going on, but there is a lot going on there. In terms of media coverage, obviously like most sports, I'm sure local newspapers, will cover the results of the local games, and that happens around the country. Our Women's National League, we have a main sponsor, Continental, and they're a fantastic sponsor for us and do an awful lot of activation. But there's no TV coverage at all for the league, unfortunately, unlike our male counterpart, the Electricity League, where there's live games. There's also little newspaper coverage, again unlike the men's league, where there's back-to-back coverage after each set of fixtures. Our Senior Cup final, as Clean has said, is live on TV, however. It's played at the Aviva Stadium as part of a doubleheader with the men's game for the last couple of years, and that's proved to be a huge success. I saw some figures for last year. I can't remember the numbers clean, but I think the viewership peaked for the women's game. What the minimum figure was, if you can understand me, the year before for the men's viewer figures. So certainly it's improving, and it's showing there is interest out there for women's football. Our international matches in the last year, the Setanta have decided to cover all our competitive home games, which is fantastic. They also showed the recent game away to the USA. That was obviously shown live in the USA, and there's a huge crowd, there's huge interest in America, as we know, in women's football. So Setanta carried that game here also, and I think they're going to carry our away game to Finland, which is like a cup final. I suppose it's do or die for us in June, so that'll be great coverage and great profile for the game as well. There's no TV coverage for our underage squads. Our under-19s hosted their elite phase in the European campaign there in the last 2 weeks again. I don't know whether any of you have heard about it or not. They played in Tallaght Stadium. They finished second in the group to Germany. Germany are a very, very strong team. 6 points out of 9. They lost the game to Germany 1-0. Really was a great accomplishment by the team, but unfortunately no live coverage for them, although the games were streamed live by fai.ie. So, the media often say to us, well, we don't carry it or we don't cover it because there's no interest in it. Well, that's not true. I'm just going to show you the interest and the numbers from around the world of people, women, girls who play the game, and indeed how it's covered in other countries. There's approximately 30 million female players worldwide, which is a huge figure. I have no idea in terms of rugby or other female sports what it is, but that to me is huge. I know most women's national leagues in other countries in Europe, there's a live game every single week. As part of whatever deals are done, or whether it's just, I know in Scandinavia it's just part of the culture because women are treated exactly like men in terms of sport and everything. I think it's a very egalitarian society. In other countries maybe it's part of TV contracts, I don't know, but there is a game every week, which is obviously great exposure for women's football and women's sport. In England, both BBC and BT Sport have a weekly sports programme showing highlights of their Super League, and that's proven to be great, and it's proven to get great interest. Now there's a lot of interest from abroad. You've top players from abroad looking to come and play in that league because of the interest it's getting, the profile it's getting, more sponsors are getting interested and getting involved, etc. At Wembley last year, there was 55,000 attended a friendly between England and Germany, and I was actually there myself. It was an awful rainy day. I think they actually sold 55,000 tickets. I think just under 50 actually turned up on the day because of the weather. It was horrific, tube strikes, all the rest. But it was also live on TV. But that's the interest in the game over there, so it's fantastic. And at the same stadium in the Olympic Games in 2012, a game against Brazil had over 70,000 people at it. I know the Olympic Games is a special event, but still it shows the interest that's there. Just a little bit about the Women's World Cup, and as Cliona said, there was some fantastic figures and records were broken. Every record, I think, in terms of attendances, in terms of viewerships, were broken at that event, and it was really a fantastic event. It was the first time 24 teams qualified. Up to that it had been 16, so an extra 8 teams in, which is great. 3 extra teams came from Europe. There's still only 7 in total come from Europe, so 7 out of 53. It's difficult enough to get there, so maybe that's one of the reasons explains why we haven't been there yet. But it was the second most watched FIFA tournament ever, second only to the 2014 Men's World Cup in Brazil. So obviously that's huge. As Cliona said, the final USA against Japan was the most watched football match in US history. And the figures actually peaked at 30 million. The average, I think, was 25. I think it was around 23 then as well. But the average 25 peaked at 30, and higher viewing figures than the NBA finals. And you know how big basketball is in the USA, so it was really fantastic. In the same tournament, England played quarter-final. By virtue of the time differences, England's games were around midnight, and their quarter-final was live on BBC. It was watched by 1.7 million. And that was in the middle of the week as well. It wasn't on a weekend. And there's record attendances at most games. Most games are sold out. So again, a fantastic occasion, shows the interest is there. I know it's the high end of the game, but still shows the interest is there. And it's certainly grown over the years than where it started in 1991 with the first World Cup. That's a picture most of you probably recognise. Most of you probably recognise that young lady, Stephanie. Stephanie, as you know, was nominated for the Puskas Goal of the Year Award in 2014. Nobody covered the game that she scored the goal in, and when I say nobody covered it, TV didn't cover it, newspapers didn't cover it. It was just, luckily enough, it was captured on video by the opponent, I think Wexford Youth's video analyst, and when it was posted on YouTube, it obviously went viral. And Stephanie was rightly so nominated, and I think if that goal had been scored in a packed stadium, she'd have won it, because without a shadow of a doubt it was technically the best goal of the three. And James Rodriguez actually said that to her at the event, in fairness. So that goal and that profile that has been built, Stephanie's now a celebrity. And it's fantastic. When she comes into camp with me and with the national team, we have a bit of a joke about it, but she's a lovely girl. She's very grounded, but she's actually got celebrity status, because anything that's going on she's invited to, and it's great for her. And the profile that has given women's football, is fantastic. My own nieces come to the national team games and they just want their photograph taken with Stephanie afterwards, not with their aunt. It's all about Stephanie. Where's Stephanie? I want the photograph taken with Stephanie. So that's what it's all about. That profile has raised the profile of the game, and is encouraging young girls to want to be Stephanie Roach and want to play football. That picture, I think, as everyone saw, is a great picture. That was the front of the newspapers. When Stephanie scored the goal, that wasn't on the back of the newspaper, so it's just a little comparison there, but great picture. I know she's proud of it. That was on the front of the newspaper. It wasn't, but. So, this is a girl, Denise O'Sullivan. I'm sure any of you from Cork know Denise O'Sullivan. Denise O'Sullivan is our current International Player of the Year. And she's just signed for Houston Dash, and there was no mention of it anywhere. It certainly wasn't front newspaper coverage. There may have been a little clip somewhere, but I didn't see it, so I won't say for sure it wasn't there, but it definitely wasn't front page coverage. When Stephanie signed for Houston Dash, because as I said, what she had done, the profile she had gained in the game, it was front page coverage. So just showing you how newspaper can drive different media can drive different things. So just to mention, and I know Fiona said about the national governing bodies needing to do something themselves. It can't be waiting. It's not all on the media, in fairness, print, TV, whatever. The national governing bodies do need to be looking after their own sport and trying to drive the women's game as well. In the FAI, in fairness, there's a lot going on. A new strategic plan has just been launched, and women's football is a key standalone pillar in it. The last one, 5-6 years ago, it was part of the grassroots pillar. Now it's a standalone pillar. The governance of women's football is changing as well. It was run by the WFAI, which is the Women's Football Association of Ireland, and they were all volunteers. It's now been integrated into the main structures in the FAI, where it'll be run by the professionals, the paid people who have the expertise, who have the time, and who will be responsible for driving it at every angle. And that includes communications, marketing, big parts of that. And that's the other side of my game. I have to oversee that, but that's a key part of the FAI strategy going forward, which I think will certainly help our game develop. We also have a dedicated website and social media channel for the Women's National League. So that's obviously great as well. And when you look on the website and you want to find out about the national teams, exactly the same as on the men's side is there for the women's side, so that's good. There's constant coverage on the social media platforms. We find that's great, no more than the other sports. That's where we're able to spread the word. That's where fans will find out about women's sport in general. So we throw loads of stuff up on social media about the leagues, about our events, about the National League, and indeed about the national teams. And then that's picked up by other outlets and other media outlets. There's always an official squad announcement around the women's national team, just like the men's. It wouldn't be as heavily attended, but in fairness, we do have one, and media are invited in, and you do get media come in. So a press release goes out and the squad's announced, and it's treated just the same. We use female players as often as we can as ambassadors. So when the launch of our summer soccer schools is going on, you might have Seamus Coleman from the men's team there. You'd have a female equivalent, say an Anya O'Gorman or a Denise O'Sullivan, whatever. Just the same, to create that bit of a profile, to show it's women's football as well as boys' football. It's football for both, and we use them for various different ambassadorial roles as such. So just that's to end, and I know we're going to have a chat now and any questions I'd be happy to take, but that's a picture I was walking out in the San Diego when we played USA. I'm losing my mind now. It was early in the year, sorry, I'm losing dates. In January we played USA in a friendly. It was 23,000 people at that stadium. It was live on TV and they get huge numbers watching. So, you know, I know women's sport in general deserves profile, but I think certainly at international level, when a female athlete is representing her country in whatever sport it is, at that level, I think she deserves recognition just as much as every man does. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sue. So I'm going to, well, I'll get the ball rolling first. I've just a couple of questions there. I'll throw it to the panel, whoever wants to answer can. I suppose the first thing, Cliona, from your talk, what struck me was that, you know, it's the women that are going to the men's matches, or the, whatever sporting events, men's sport, how do we get them to come to the women's events? And also, like, is it a matter of, obviously the soccer put the cup finals together, which I think is a great idea, so can the same be done with the rugby, with the soccer? And again, I think in Ireland we're very much team based. Our interests are in soccer, rugby, GA, we have a bit of golf and horse racing, alright, but you know, we're very team based, so is it those sports that the women playing those games, are they the ones we need to focus on? Or obviously we need to focus on everything, but that's where the attention is, or that's what people, what do you think?
Yes, yeah, I do think that like the sports organisations, by marrying a men's event with the women's event, you'll get that Trojan horse, the men's game, because obviously the men's game has a bigger audience than the women's game. So by putting them together, like the happened in Twickenham in 2014, where you had England-Ireland men followed by England-Ireland women, and as long as the schedules are clear, then the broadcaster can show it indefinitely. I mean, it's just, if the game is successful, and if they are, and you know, particularly the Irish team, and I get what Sue was saying, you know, in terms of television audiences, but the audiences are not there for soccer as much as they are for women's soccer, as much as they are for rugby, because of the success of the national team. And hopefully if we do get to the Europeans, and it would be fantastic if we did, then definitely RT would be absolutely interested in wanting to cover that, because like that is we do national teams, national games and major events. So when women's sport gets to a certain level, then we will absolutely be covering it. But like, I do think that sports organisations do have a responsibility to tie in maybe rights as well, like, you know, and that's the case, say, with the FAI, and tying in the league rights with the national men's team. But if a lot of sports organisations say to media organisations, well, if you want this, which is the blue ribbon event, well then you're going to need to cover a women's game, our women's game as well, to a certain extent, not overly, because it costs money, but at the same time maybe to cover the 1, 2, 3 events that are important to the sports organisation, then I think change will happen.
Very good. Anyone else?
Just on the games, head-to-head games, I think the women's, from a female supporter's point of view, they have to happen after the games from a ticketing point of view, because if you're, obviously tickets are hard to get. I know 55,000 in the Aviva, but they're hard to get, and they're at a premium price going to the men's game. So if you have the women's game beforehand, our fans will have to fork out and will have difficulty getting tickets. So I think it has to happen afterwards. But then it's around, we played in the Aviva in 2014, and we got changed in Lansdowne, and we were walking across to go into the Aviva, and these crowds were screaming at us, and it was one of the most memorable moments. But then I realised as I was walking in, they were actually all leaving the stadium, and we actually played in front of probably only 8,000 people. So there was 55,000 there for, it was Brian Driscoll's last game, and only about 8,000. I don't know how many stayed, some came in, and it's kind of, your game is your fans are lost when you're playing in a big stadium and there's only 7,000 there. It's brilliant to play at the National Stadium, but when you don't have a big crowd there, they are lost, and that's why I like the move to Donnybrook, because it kind of, you get that crowd, and if it's on TV, then you can hear the crowd, and it makes more of an atmosphere as well.
Very good. Now,
a point on that beyond with that game, the Italy game in the Aviva, I didn't have tickets for the match beforehand. I had a ticket for
had a ticket for the women's game, and in spite of being there half an hour early, we missed the first 20 minutes of the match because the Aviva people trying to get the people leaving out. Like, it was such a big occasion. We wanted to be there for the line-up, for the anthems and all that, and we missed it all.
Yeah, I think it was a learning process for the IRFU, and it was a logistical nightmare. I think they should have just opened one, like Twickenham just open up every door and people can come in and come out, but I suppose it's the way the Aviva is built. But I think they've learned from that, and if we have a game going forward, it will be sorted. But I know a lot of people did miss the first 20 minutes, my parents included.
Would your preference be then to put the women's games on before the men's games? Because at least then you're getting a swell of a crowd coming in as well.
You will have more of a crowd, but it comes back then to the tickets and how people get access to the tickets, whether they're members of clubs or if fans of the women's game can afford to pay that price, and if they can, brilliant. But you don't want to forget about our fans that have been supporting through the years, that now it's before the men's game, so they have to buy the tickets for the men's game and they might not have an opportunity to get them.
Yeah. Sure.
Yes, Sue.
So just in relation to soccer, unfortunately when it comes to competition, there's rules with UEFA and FIFA that there can't be anything on the pitch 24 hours before a competitive game, so that would knock out a double header either way, whether it was us first or the men first. Unlike in the cup final, there isn't that type of an issue, so that's one problem we face. I think also Cliona mentioned, the interest isn't there and the stands are empty, and I completely I buy that and I understand that, Cliona. I suppose one goes with the other for me. If the media is interested or if the interest is shown, that will start attracting sponsors, which will in turn put more money into the game, which will in turn help the teams develop more to qualify for finals of competitions. And I know the media will be there if it's successful, but sometimes to be successful, more resources are required. And I'm speaking obviously for soccer. We're playing teams that are fully professional. We just don't have a professional league here. We don't have those resources. So, in order for us to qualify for a major competition, it's going to take a huge effort, and for us to get there, we probably need more resources, and more sponsors will be able to provide those resources, and the sponsors will be interested if it's out there and it's on TV and it's in the paper.
Very good.
Just as one of the people that probably ignored a lot of women's sport over the years, columnists. One of the reasons that we don't do more, is because we don't know that things are going on. You mentioned about the girl that went to, Hughes, which is a huge club I know in the States. Why didn't someone pick up the phone? Because I wake up some Friday mornings in a complete blind panic as to what I'm going to write for Saturday, and I haven't a clue what I'm going to write. I'd love a phone call and someone said, we've got a great story about a girl who's going to Houston. Why don't you ring up and ask, canvas, it works. Definitely,
Is it not your job?
No, it's not my job to do that, because I can't watch everything that's going on.
No, but it's your job to actually know what's going on in those organisations.
It's impossible.
You should be ringing them up. It's not impossible. It clearly isn't.
You can't follow everything that's going on.
No, but you can't assume that all of the organisations need to come to you. It's your job to actually go out and get the information.
No, it's not. No, there's so
Actually,
much.
can I just interject there?
There's so much.
I'm actually going to defend this man in one way.
I know what you're saying, but speaking as a journalist myself, it is your job to actually find out what's going on.
I'm a columnist, as you know, there's a difference. I'm not full-time at it.
Same here.
So.
Well, just from my own experience, I set up the website sportswomen.ie, and I'm doing it on my own, so I actually find it difficult. I know what's going on, but if I have to go and find it, I find it difficult. Whereas if it comes to me, it's much easier. So I do think the information is going to places, but it's not being picked up because it's been swamped by male sport. That's what I think anyway.
I agree with you 100%. Yeah. A part of it as well is that if you put a bit of pressure on us as well, ring up and say, you're not doing your job right, as you said, you're not doing your job right, you haven't written about women's sport for 3 months or 4 months, why don't you do this? You'd be amazed at the response you get. You kind of look back and say, oh yeah, I haven't done this, and then give us a good story. You're not going to just write a story about all women's, as Neil said, all women are great, we all love women, my mother's a woman, hooray. You have to have something first to write about as well, something that's obviously that will catch the people's attention. And another aspect, I'm coming from the point of view of the man who started ladies Gaelic football and Coach Savannah McCarthy at least swiped her for the soccer. So that's where I'm coming from. And fellas in my own club said they're only fit for making sandwiches. And Noreen O'Sullivan, the Garda Commissioner, was also asked to make the sandwiches at a meeting one time by Chief Super, and she walked out. So like, I'm not kind of coming from a ich bin feminist, like, or whatever it's called. I have one wife and 3 daughters, so I'm going for someone that supports it. But put a bit more pressure on us, ring us up. Give us, let us know what's going on. I can't watch everything that's going on in the world. I'm running the pub as well, like. I just don't have the time. Like, if you think I'm going to be on Facebook or Twitter all day long, I barely know how to work it, like, so. But I got a call from a ladies' football team, and they were beaten in the All-Ireland final, and this girl said to me, how come nobody ever writes about the losers? So I went down to Mallow. I spent a great day there with her, and I got my best story of the year. I think it was the best one I did. It was where Karen Buckley comes from, the poor girl who was killed, and she turned out she played with the team, and it was a great story, and people really liked it. So it's there, like. And another thing I really like what you said, Neil, there's no point, like, very often what kind of hits the newspapers in particular is achievement. So writing about women's sport just to say because they're women, that's not enough, really. The women have to achieve as well. Like Katie Taylor is on the front page of everything. She lost, but she's won so much. So the reason she got there was because she was the best in the world. So to push up our standards is very important, to get the coverage. Also, this is something that this will be the big thing for me, having been involved coaching women's Gaelic football teams for a good few years, is that when the girls hit about 15 or 16, it's very hard to keep them in sport. And I'd love if there was a study or something. I have my own kind of ideas about why or why not, you know, because we had great players. And when they hit 15 or 16, they just seem to give up. I think a lot of it might have been peer pressure. Maybe you're not, you know, it's not girly enough and stuff like that. And it just drives me crazy. And I'd say, just look at the role models around you. Look at them. Look at how well they look. Look, you know, it really bugged me. And I'd love if there was a proper study done, a psychology study done as to why, because that's when you're losing the girls. And then they kind of go back into the gym then when they're 21 or 22. I can't think of a more boring place to spend your life when you could be out running, playing Gaelic football or soccer. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in finding out why that is. There's a huge gap there. That's my views on it.
Thank you.
Just picking up on one point there, sorry.
In terms of standards and achievement and everything, I find it so curious that women's sport coverage always has to be achievement focused, as if it's not worth covering until they're the best in the world. Yeah. You have the greatest load of lumps on the Irish male soccer team, kicking the ball around. Like, I think they're terrible players. I'm a huge soccer fan, yet it's blanket coverage on them. So I really think that it's a fallacy to say in order for women to get more coverage, they actually need to be the best in the world. So I think we should be covering it anyway as a default, because there are certainly terrible Irish teams and terrible local teams who are covered very widely, regardless of how they do. I understand that, you know, achievement brings fans actually, but achievement isn't a default mechanism for coverage. It's something that, you know, the Irish women's rugby team have been fantastic for Irish sport because they've done so well. But I think saying we'll only cover you when you start making tournaments, winning things and everything is grossly unfair, because I think that Irish men's sport, no matter how many times it fails nationally, actually gets all the coverage it wants.
Thank you. Anne-Marie back here.
Thanks. I'd like to back up what Una said there. I certainly would agree that it shouldn't be just on the basis of achievement, and certainly there are double standards in terms of the coverage for men and for women, and let's not be under any illusions about that. Men are prioritised and the financial structures are in place to support their game, but not the women's game. So there is an argument, I think, for cutting women some slack in order to enhance women's coverage. But that's not my question. My question is actually for Cliona, and it's a really specific question, and it was about your audience metrics. I wanted to ask you how you were able to evaluate whether or not it was women who were watching the sporting games. I was just curious about that.
We have an audience insights team, and Nielsen is the ratings provider, and they're worldwide, and they do have an ability to be able to break down the demographics for everything. They can even go down as far as 15 to 24s, they can target various different ages and the gender as well. So we get this off a company, they're Nielsen, they provide it worldwide, and there's certain boxes in various different homes around the country, and they take all their metrics, but it's the worldwide breakdown of audiences. But
how does that interact with your dealings with advertisers then in terms of what's being shown?
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned you singled out Liberty, and we've all heard about what Lidl are up to, so are you taking any steps there to kind of proactively feed information through to the advertisers as opposed to having them tell you what they want?
The Audience Insights team were specifically set up actually with advertising in mind, because advertisers they target their audiences, so they know what programs, housekeepers or they'd be various different demographics of ages of 50 plus and men, and all of those there's a huge breakdown of all of the different categories. So absolutely, when they go when RT goes to meet the ad agencies, they want every bit of that detail to be able to target their advertising around it. But I mean, just to go back to the point earlier about women's sport and men's sport, I mean, and this is something that I was trying to express earlier, but men are bigger champions of women's sport than women are, and that's a really big point, because in actual fact, 60-70% of our audiences are men and not women when we show women's sport, and actually more women turn up to watch men's sport than they do to watch women's sport. And when you're talking about the amount of coverage of men's sport, an awful lot of that is because men and women go to those, and maybe it's because we were all brought up going to men's sport and supporting men's sport, and we need to change that, and there's a number of different factors in how that happens. But I do think, because I'm looking at it from investment, and invest in 50, 60, 70, 80 grand, and we're a public service broadcaster, and you've got to look at, well, what does the majority want? And we can't just invest in something that isn't proven either, so the women's rugby team has done really successfully, and so the women's rugby team has the coverage, but success has to happen first, and then...
Well, as a public service broadcaster, your remit is to educate, inform and entertain. So you've got to cover all of those bases as well. It can't be limited to the financing model that you're touting there.
Yeah.
So you've got to go beyond. You've got to go the step beyond, I would argue, Cliona, and give women that space that they need without thinking too much about the finance that is involved. And I think what Lidl has done is incredible, actually, because I think they're going to. They've won a space in the hearts of women. I'm a media studies lecturer in the Institute of Technology in Tala, and I do advertising with my students. We look at ads. I spoke to you about this earlier today, and to actually find an ad that positively shows the female form, that isn't throwing like a girl, for instance, is virtually impossible. So I would like to see RTE stepping up and giving the kind of coverage that is needed without saying we need the money first.
Yeah,
impossible, I know.
And I think you're right about public service broadcasters, and you saw it in the figures that I showed earlier. The BBC kept their cameras on for the England-Ireland women's game following the England-Ireland's women's game last year. This year we had no coverage of the women's England-Ireland game because ITV turned their cameras off. So public service broadcasters do take it very seriously, and we're not saying we got it right, absolutely not. And we've got a 5-year strategy with women's sport at the heart of it, because, like you're saying, we have a responsibility in that regard, and we haven't gotten it right. And Ryan Nugent, his group head of sport, has come out and said that as well, and we're very much targeting, and that's why we're working with sports organisations to try and see, and sponsors, to see what we can do better and how we can, get more coverage for women's sport on television.
Thanks, Cliona.
Okay, I think on that note, there's a lot of food for thought there. I'd especially like to thank our 5 speakers here today. If you could give them all a good round of applause. Thank you. So I'm handing back to Joan here now. Thanks, Joan.
Okay, well done, Sharon, and an amazing panel of ladies. I don't think you'd find it anywhere else, only in Ballybunny, so congratulations, girls. Sterling performance and amazing, amazing, amazing